identify some key Bible passages that relate to Israel, and in fact we're going to talk about why Israel matters at all. And then we're going to look at some historical events that have happened to Israel that actually line up with these particular prophecies. And then together, if we take those two things and bring them together, we can make a connection between these events and a belief that God is real. So we should be able to get a sense tonight about how much Israel matters to God and proves his existence. Now, this idea about the existence of Israel is fundamental for many people that believe in the Bible that's in front of us. But why Israel anyway? Well, I just need to maybe just bring to mind some knowledge you might have around Israel, and your base of knowledge about Israel might be quite low, and you might, even when you think about Israel from a religious context, hear terms like Judaism or Christianity and go, are they the same? Are they different? What do we mean by each of those things here? And if I use this particular map that's on this slide here, there's two things on this slide. The right-hand side is more of a modern map about Israel, which reflects the boundaries as we might draw them today, and Israel there being in the white. And that might be all that you can recognise about Israel. And how does any of this relate to Israel's history? Well, if you're a history student, you might be able to go back a little in time to some of the World War II and how Israel came to have the events that was the genesis for them getting into that land. In very recent times, you might go, well, I know there's a lot of conflict in the land of Israel between the people of Palestine and Israel. And I can see when you look at a map like that, you can go, the boundaries there are quite tight, and I can understand maybe from a logistics point of view, if you don't know anything about the land, why there might be some tension there. On the left-hand side of the map, of the slide, is another map. And that's got lots of different places and events that are actually recorded in the Bible itself. So if we can accept for a moment that God is in the authorship of the Bible, and we know that all those events that take place, or many of the events that happen in this Bible, happen in that land, and we pull that forward to our more modern map, we can start to appreciate that if God is an author of the Bible and a lot of the events that he describes about his people Israel happened a long time ago in this particular location, it can change our view of how we look at this modern map of Israel. In fact, we're going to be able tonight to look at some specific Bible prophecies with their historical events that are used by believers to support their faith, both in understanding God's plan with Israel and the reality of God. It's very, very common for us to think about places in general to have deep-rooted historical contexts which are very important to how we think about things today. I'm going to go for a couple of examples outside of the Bible. Australia itself would think very significantly about a place called Gallipoli. The Australian people recognise a place on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey because of what happened on the 25th of April 1915, and it's something that's recognised particularly on Anzac Day each year. So that was a time when Allied troops landed there. It was a strategy to help out in the war, but there was 16,000 Australian and New Zealanders that landed at that location on that day, and it was a terrible situation because by that evening 2,000 of them had been killed or wounded. So that campaign, Gallipoli campaign, is considered a military failure, but Australians today see the significance about bravery, ingenuity, endurance, mateship as a defining characteristic of what it means to be Australian, linking to that event. And that's why it sits strong in the fabric of Australia. So there's an example of a location, even for ourselves here in Australia, even not in Australia, that has a very important historical link. And we're going to look at some things here in this land of Israel that have got important historical links, both for the people of Israel and God tonight. Another example that's quite topical over the last week is a particular cemetery in the US called Arlington Cemetery. So there's a section there called Section 60, which is a solemn 14-acre section at that cemetery that's reserved for deceased US veterans of war of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's considered so sacred or solemn that only cemetery staff members are authorised to take photographs or film in this area by the law of the US government. And so if that is perceived to have been violated, it draws a very strong emotional response. Again, and that's important for the citizens of the US. So we return to a slide in front of us about Israel and say, well, we could look at this and go, hey, this is just land today. But what we know from the way that we think about culture and customs and symbols is we need to go back and look at what has happened in the past in order to help us think about things in the future. So about this people of Israel, they've got a very storied history. And one of those things that happened about them is an event that's called the Exodus. And that refers to a time when all the people of Israel, as they were known at that time, called the children of Israel, it's recorded in the second book of the Bible, called Exodus. They came out of slavery from Egypt and moved up to the land, which then was called Canaan, and started to occupy that land. In the Jewish festival calendar, which started way back then, there's a feast which is called the Feast of Passover. Today, that same feast or festival recognises that first occasion where they came out of Egypt, and they believe, and I'll show this shortly, that God said, I'm going to take you one day out of the land of Egypt, and that established their faith in God and their entitlement to this land of Israel. So the passage that, and I will turn that up, so there's a few little things from the Bible I need to introduce. So in terms of some genealogies, because families, when they got big enough, turned into nations, the family that started Israel was under a man called Abram, and God made a promise to him one day and said, you're going to occupy this land, but it's going to be at a certain point in time. Now, this is recorded in Genesis chapter 15 and verse 13, and I'm just going to read that for you. I don't have a slide for it. But in Genesis 15 verse 13, he says, effectively, I know, Abraham, you're dwelling in a tent today. That's your life. And I want you to know that your children or your offspring is also going to be sojourners or nomads in a land that is not theirs, and they're going to be servants there, and they're going to be afflicted for 400 years or 4 generations, depending on the Bible version you're looking at. 400 years. So God has made a promise to a man, and he's put a specific end date out there of 400 years, and it connects to this land. So we're starting to get the enmeshment of God, the land of Israel, and understanding the reality of God himself. The events that are on this slide happen 400 years after that promise was spoken. So significant, the Jews talk about it in terms of their Passover. And in fact, later in the Bible, when there's another man called Stephen, he reflects back in time about the significance of how important that was to the Jewish people when he gives a speech in the book of Acts in chapter 7. And in his speech, he was telling the people, and God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be strangers in a land belonging to others who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. So the fact that that prophecy was made and came to pass about that land gave him the confidence to say, God's real. And in fact, everybody in his audience, bringing it back up to their consciousness, could say, God is real. So these are not just abstract dates that are put in the Bible and you can go, well, they've nicely interlocked all the facts and they've made it robust. It can also be proven externally from the Bible as well. So it starts to tell us a little bit about where the Jews place their faith in God. So the Jews have got a number of different symbols. There's a few more on this particular page. Now, not all symbols about the Jewish people are going to take us to an understanding of God. So there's 3 of the most popular symbols of the Jewish people on this slide. What do these symbols or these artefacts represent, and why are they important to understanding Israel's religious significance? Well, the first one there is called the Star of David. Now, David is a major character in the Bible. He's considered to be the first great king of Israel. That 6-pointed star, no reference to that in the Bible at all. Yes, it's named after David. There is legend, of course, that gets built around symbols that says that David had a 6-pointed star stamped on the shield of his army when they went out to battle. But it's most commonly recognised that it had its roots in 17th century Europe and it was prominent in architecture, and then it got co-opted by a group of people who were Jews in Europe and saying, hey, we want to move to Israel one day, called the Zionist movement. And they grabbed that symbol and took it as their own. And then it started to be associated with the Jewish people. So then it was a positive, but it also became a negative as per the black and white image in the bottom left-hand corner, which it was that 6-point star was made yellow and was used to identify the Jewish people before they were rounded up and persecuted as part of the Second World War. And that goes deeply to the national identity today. The one in the middle is a sacred place called the Western Wall. It's in the old city of Jerusalem. Lots of people go there today as a place for prayer and pilgrimage. You can go, why that location? You know, it's a stone wall? What's so storied? What's so interesting about that location? Well, that particular site is seen as the site of the first and the second temples in Jerusalem. And that's considered today by the Jewish people to be uniquely holy to them. Now, those first and second temples are recorded in the Bible and goes to the fabric of God's relationship with his people, because you can go, well, if God is interested in these people, poses a question, why aren't they just living a life of happiness? Why do they have this contention that they have all through the world and all through their history? And the last one is both a location and then what was found at that location, which is called the Dead Sea Scrolls, which by their name was found in the location of the Dead Sea in the land of Israel. So that was a set of manuscripts that were discovered in this cave, and basically the entire book of the Bible was found to be written on these particular scrolls. And what that did is it said, hey, here's some real evidence that we've had our Bible come through this particular journey in time. Then they found this very old set of scrolls, and they came together and able to say that they matched. And what that tells us then is the authenticity and the reliance that we can have on the Bible as it's been held to us or delivered down to us today. We read it in English. The heritage of the Bible text either is written basically in the Hebrew language or the Greek language. So what I'm just doing is just activating your knowledge about just things in Israel and realising that they've had a pretty storied history, and also because of tonight's lecture title, we're thinking about God and this people. So we sort of have to realise what's happened around Israel to understand, is God real or not? I found this little infographic on the web, which just describes Israel's significance, or Israel's history and its significance with two world religions, Judaism and Christianity. So it dates that the first 5 books of the Bible, which are also known as the Torah, were written way back around 3000 BCE, or also known as BC, depending on the way you use timelines. And then the Bible also describes, particularly in the books Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, the establishment of the Jewish religion. Later on, Christ is born, and shortly after that, in a long-term worldview, 33 years, the death of Christ. And then what happened to the movement that Christ started creates what we can call the early church and the spread of religion. So those disciples took their message through all the world, particularly through what we would call today modern Europe, and of course into Europe. Then we've got the story of what's happening in European history, and particularly around a man called Constantine, who adopted Christianity as a world religion. And because it was a world religion, it then spread further and further, as the Europeans are known for going through all the world and going to South America, Africa, and indeed over here in Australia. And then we've got the role of Martin Luther's protest to do Protestantism, which is just a counterbalance to what he saw as how the religion of Constantine had become impure in his point of view. But again, with all this agitation and going through all the world, again, I left off when I talked about Europe becoming the great explorers, off to what was known as the New World, which is America. And while you go, okay, there's maybe just some interesting facts there, Scott. You know, how has the history of Israel influenced religious religions today. Are we sensitive to conflict in the land of Israel today? Absolutely. Do we, as Christadelphians, have an opinion on the war today that might be perceived as political? Absolutely not. We have no political point of view. We can share things that might be interpretive about how the conflict that's happening is deeply rooted in the history of these people fighting in that land. But what we also know in terms of this spread of the Christian message is it helps us understand, for instance, why the US might be so favourably disposed over time to Israel, because of what you see here on the chart in front of us, which is that America was established with a very strong Christian-based ethos, which they hold today still. But there is conflict in that land today, and the reason for that is effectively the two groups, so Israel, they will trace the family history all the way back to a man named Abraham, and he was mentioned in the quote that I read out from Genesis chapter 15. I'm going to read another one shortly. But the Palestinians, they also chase their history all the way back to the same man. And so it means that when we get quotes that refer to Abraham and promises to Abraham, they're loaded with interest for these particular groups. And for us, it puts a magnifying glass on the relationship that God might have with these people. Now, tonight, we're going to just stay down the path of Abraham and his son called Isaac and his son called Jacob. But the Bible does talk about his other son Ishmael as well. So what's one of those quotes? One of those quotes is here in Genesis chapter 15. This is a promise quote. So just understanding where the emotion is around this land and this people that we just can see on a map today, like any other country. So God said to this man Abraham, before I had given you the quote around him being told you're going to be tent dwellers and one day your seed's going to be enslaved for 400 years. Same chapter makes this big promise that I'm going to give you this land that you're in from the river of Egypt, which would be the river Nile, all the way around, further sweeping north to the river Euphrates. Huge tract of land in the Middle East. And as you can read on the slide there, lots of different places along the way. They would be ancient names for those lands, wouldn't be the way that we refer to those lands today. So what we have there is these people getting a promise from God about the land. So again, we can, for the purpose of tonight, saying, is God real? We can make this connection between God, he makes a promise about the people and the land. So proving God is real, we can think about how God deals with these people and what's happening in that land. Remember, before I shared the story around the Passover and Israel leaving Egypt. Well, when they did leave Egypt and they were on the cusp of going into the land of Canaan to take it up as their own land, aligned with that prophecy that went for 400 years, the leader of Israel at that time, a man called Moses, reiterated this same prophecy, and he said, and I call heaven and earth to witness against you today. So he's talking to that people of Israel. I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse, and I want you to choose life that you and your offspring may live, loving your God, obeying his voice and holding fast to him, for he is your life and length of days, that you may dwell in the land that God swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, to give them. So Moses is reflecting into that passage from Genesis before to say this land from the Nile through the Euphrates One day all of that needs to be yours. But there's an extra little clue in there. It's because it's not just straight entitlement, as in it's all yours, do what you like with it. There's conditions put in there because, which is just hinted in this little extract that I've got in the quote in front of us. He said, I've set before you life and death, blessing and curse, a positive and negative. Well, obviously life and blessing would be taking hold of this land. A curse or death would not be. And he's encouraging them to choose the right path and life, which says that in terms of God's relationship with Israel, he's looking for them to have a relationship with them, which in this verse is characterised as life and blessing. Not to do that is death and a curse. And this is going to be really important because when you raise a challenge point, which is, if God is so real, why does his people keep going into captivity? And you need a quote like before to actually say, well, God has got a character and he's put out some conditions of his relationship with Israel about how that it's going to work. But there's some headline prophecy that he keeps anchoring back to, which is a story, like he said to Abraham, he's committed to giving Abraham this piece of land. Other parts of the Bible talk about people that go and attack Israel like they are touching the apple of God's own eye. That's mentioned in the book of Zechariah, chapter 2 and verse 8. Or God saying, you can prove my existence by what's happening to Israel. In Isaiah 43 verse 10, he says there, you, Israel, are my witnesses, saith God, and my servant whom I have chosen, that you may know and believe me and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. Again, just a little bit of Bible language just to help us navigate these points. The nation we know today as Israel started with Abraham. He had a son called Isaac, had another son called Jacob. Jacob had a name change to Israel. He had some children, the children of Israel, and then they formed nationhood as Israel. So that's sometimes why it can be confusing to find in the Bible a quote that just helps stitch all these points together, and that comes with being more familiar with the Bible text. But it's abundantly clear through the history of Israel that they have these cycles of being in their land and then they're off dispersed, captive, your choice of term. And we've already looked at this 430 years or 400 years of oppression which ended in Egypt. And then there was an exodus. But then later on during Israel's history, they split into two major groups. One was called Israel in the northern geography area, and in the southern geography area was a group called Judah. Interesting fact, if you sort of wonder why Israel today is not always known as Israelis, sometimes they're called Jews. It's going to come from this Judah group and being shorted, Judah to the Jews. And so they became captives, and the northern group went off to an area up the north called Assyria. The group down south later on, in another invasion from the then world power called Babylon, went to Babylon. But they came back from Babylon. The Jewish group, or the Judah group, came back into that land and called Israel again. And that was the group that was in the land until through the time that Jesus was born. And at the time Jesus was born, the world power of the day, Rome, was in the land. So Jesus died around AD 33, and around AD 70, Rome basically pushed over Jerusalem, destroyed it, and they sent all the people back into Europe, because that's the Roman Empire through Europe. Fast forward a long time into the 1940s and World War II, and we have the despicable actions from Hitler that agitated all the Jewish people to say, hey, we've got to get back to our land. And they went from Europe back into Israel, which is where they are today. Why do we need to know that history? Well, remember, we're searching for a relationship with God, his people, his land, and what's going on there. So we can map some Bible quotes to these cycles. So here's the first one. So this one here is in the book of Deuteronomy. Now, where does that fit in the Bible in terms of the context? So it's after that first cycle that I spoke about, which is the Jews being captive in Egypt, ending after 430 years. And then Moses, before they're going into the land to take it and make it their own, he's giving a speech. It's recorded in Deuteronomy. So they've been through, you could say, cycle one. And he's actually telling them, I know you're going into the land. I'm going to let you know there's going to be another cycle. Let me read that for you. And when all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among the nations where God has driven you. So he's indicating in a prophecy, there's going to be a time where you aren't going to be having a solid relationship with God. In fact, you're going to have decided a relationship with God is not for you, and you're going to be in captivity. When you're in captivity, you're going to be going, effectively, this isn't much fun, would rather be in our own land. He says, when you're going to call this to mind among all the nations where God has driven you and return to your God, so relationship with God matters to being in the land, you and your children obey his voice and all that I command you today with all your heart, all your soul, then God will restore your fortunes and mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where God has scattered you. If your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there God will gather you, and from there he will take you. God will bring you into the land that your fathers possessed, that ye may possess it, and he will make you more prosperous and numerous than your fathers. So what we are seeing here is that while we might have this challenge that it looks like Israel gets this very hard time about being in and out of their land, we also have quotes that says, God says, you're actually going to know I'm real by what's happening to Israel. And that reality comes from seeing Bible prophecies like this, which is understanding God's put a conditional statement around Israel and his relationship with them, not as just a straight entitlement that this land is all theirs and he will just look after them and everything will be all rosy. Here's another quote in the book of Ezekiel. Again, we are marching on well through the passage of time, and we're into another cycle of Israel's history. I'm going to read the quote and then I'm just going to say some more about that. So this prophet Ezekiel, speaking on behalf of God, says, "Thus saith God, behold, I will take the people of Israel from the nations among where they've gone, and I will gather them from all around and bring them to their own land. And I will make them one nation in the land, on the mountains of Israel, and one king shall be king over them all, and they shall no longer be two nations and no longer divided into two kingdoms." So what's relevant about that? Well, I'll just call back up this slide here. See in that bottom left-hand corner, they became captive. And they got separated into two groups. We had Israel that went off into captivity in Assyria, and Judah down to Babylon. Well, those two groups, they're highlighted in the yellow on this slide. So there was those two groups which had two kings, and in this prophecy it says there's going to come a point where there's going to be one king over those two groups. In fact, we're not even going to talk about them as two groups anymore. That hasn't happened because today Israel doesn't have a king at all. So you can go, okay, that's open, which means that you could say there's, for us trying to believe about the reality of God, you could say there's some risk here known as faith. And the way we build up faith is to test all the other things that are happening about what God has represented in the Bible to know if it's true or not. And it says there that God will take the people in the orange back to their own land. So you could say, well, that bit's happened. First bit's happened. They're back in Israel today. But that second bit, the king part, that hasn't happened. So you can say, maybe that means, and I offer, that that's a work in progress prophecy where you can go part A, done, but part B, not done. Here's another one of these same cycles. In that day, the Lord or God will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnants of his people from Assyria, from Egypt, from Pathros, Cush, Elam, Shinar, Hamath, and the coastlands of the sea. And he will raise a signal for the nations and will assemble the banished of Israel and gather the dispersed of Judah from the four corners of the earth. Why am I using this particular quote? We have the word Assyria in the top half, about recovering a remnant from there, and other locations, but focus in on Assyria. And the last part, Judah. So like in this quote, we had the need for those two tribal groups to come together as one. We have the same here in Assyria and Judah, and that's because of what we saw way back in their history when they became captives off into two separate groups. Israel, the northern part, went off into Assyria. And that happened so long ago. But we had Judah, that group that went into Babylon. At least they came back and had a cycle through the land again. So the idea of getting the Assyrian group back into the land, you could say, well, that's quite difficult, isn't it? But if you do know something about the Jewish people today, you know that they are absolutely fastidious about tracing their family heritage and understanding that they are indeed Jews. And think about their genealogy and their family history. But it also goes to both what we can see in the enormous tragedy of the Jews coming back into their land from the 1940s onwards, which is terrible and shocking events, effectively shakes the tree and creates so much trauma that they flee back into this land. It has to be significant in order to get people to shift, because you can go, well, you know, do I like living where I'm living today? I've got my family, got my circle of friends. So you wouldn't be prepared to shift. But if you're under attack, you would think about that. Yeah, that's kind of the scale that was happening in World War II, which brought Israel back into the land. And like the second part of the verse here starts to talk about a signal. We use the word signal. This is God saying this. It's like, hey, if you see a signal, God's real. That's what's going on. So it really starts to stitch together these particular points, which is the relationship between God in the Bible, God of the Bible, is seen in his people, Israel, and his relationship with them, and what's been happening through their storied history. But there's a big question mark still, because do we go, is Israel today really comfortable, living at peace? No, of course. If I continued that, it would seem quite sarcastic, wouldn't it? Because major conflict in the Middle East. And in fact, God makes a comment about that too. He says, Jerusalem, that city, is going to talk about it as being a burdensome stone for all the people. And when people think about that city, the prophecy that Christ gave himself, he said it's going to be cause distress with perplexity, serious agitation. And that's what we have today. People going, how do we sort out between the Palestinians and Israel? Can't they live at peace? Should all be given to one or the other? Or how's a two-state solution going to work? And nobody can work their way through that particular problem. That's perplexity, isn't it? So sitting underneath the surface of world events is all these things that start to evidence that the God of the Bible, who gives out prophecies, says, I'm in control, and you can look at what's happening in Israel and know that I'm real. And it's not just some big, long-term, far-fetched prophecy, because you've had proof points along the way in Israel's history. The first one was over a cycle of 400 years, when they went into Egypt, came out, and today continue to anchor the Jewish faith around the Passover, and knowing that God keeps his promises. And the Jewish people today are thinking, I want God to fully keep his promise as he related to Abraham and give us this land at peace from all the nations round about. But remember before how I said we've got like part A in place, sorted out in terms of the Jews being in the land, but we don't have, I'll just call the slide up here, we don't have that second part there in the yellow, one king shall be king over them all, and they're going to be a unified people. Well, in order to get them as a unified people, to that prophecy, they need a king. And just to lift your knowledge of the Bible, this is where the story about Jesus matters. In fact, Jesus, as a man, was a man born with the promise that he would be king. Lots of passages in the Bible that talk about him going to be the king. And I've got there Psalm 2, verse 6 to 12, I'll set my king on my holy hill of Zion. There was all these prophecies pointing forward to one day there's going to be a king. When Jesus was born, before Jesus was born, the angel appeared to his mother Mary and said, you're going to have a child and his name's going to be called Jesus, and he's going to inherit the throne of David, and he's going to reign over it forever. So he's the one. You can go, well, he was crucified. Again, that's one of these things which I would refer to as a part A, part B prophecy, which is in Jesus' life, he died and was raised, and there's a passage of time before he has to return to the earth to set up this throne, because he has to be on that throne to fulfill that prophecy that's on that slide there from Luke chapter 1, or that prophecy way back in the book of Isaiah to stitch together the two tribal groups of Israel, being Judah and Israel, in their land, or it needs to pull together a promise made to Abraham that he is going to be in this land forever from the Nile through to the Euphrates. All of that has to happen. That's all, very simply put, part B. But we have a whole heap of confidence about what's happening in terms of God being real from all the part A pieces that we've worked through tonight. So it moves the topic then from just being an abstract academic thing to actually saying, hey, I think I'm starting to get some clues here about why the Bible's written, because I'm starting to understand who God is, starting to understand what the plan and purpose of God is. And part of it is referred to as the hope of Israel, because it started with Abraham, and again to reiterate, Abraham had a son called Isaac, had a son, ended up having a name called Israel. So they carry that promise that we are talking about right from the beginning of the Bible in Genesis chapter 15. So powerful that a major apostle who wrote a significant portion of the New Testament says in his journey to go and spread this message that he was so passionate about, talked about it as being the hope of Israel, he was locked up for a time period. He was bound with chains, so he was imprisoned. And the Bible is not just a restrictive hope to Israel, it actually is an expansive hope. And that was the idea about why Christianity, as it was earliest referred to, went through initially Europe and then out to the rest of the world with this concept of baptism, because of quotes like we find here in Galatians chapter 3, which is, you can be associated with Christ and Abraham, and part of these promises, if you are baptised into Christ. And that is in verse 16 of Galatians chapter 3, which I don't have on the slide there. I've got an excerpt from verses 27 to 30. So in terms of our topic tonight, how does Israel's existence prove that God is real? So we've stepped through some Bible prophecies as they relate to Israel. And then we have spent some time looking at the relationship between historical events that have happened that align with these prophecies. And what I've represented to you is what believers of the Bible make as the connection between these historic events and the belief that God indeed is real. So I hope that's been helpful in your understanding of this topic. Thank you.